Kofi Lawson stood alone in his penthouse, gazing out at the glowing skyline that stretched beneath him like an endless sea of lights. The city pulsed with ambition, with dreams being made and broken at every corner. Yet in the silence of his high-rise, Kofi felt a growing emptiness, a hollow that even his billion-dollar empire couldn't fill. He had everything: wealth, power, influence. But none of it seemed to matter when he found himself looking into the mirror each morning and wondering, is this all there is? His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. A message from Naomi, his stunning girlfriend, popped up. "Missing you in Dubai, babe. Can't wait to see you." XX, he smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. Naomi was beautiful, no doubt, but her affection always seemed to come with an expiration date, tied to his fortune, his status. "Sir, the car is ready," came the soft voice of Genevieve, his maid. She stood at the doorway, her gaze soft but never lingering. There was something different about her, something Kofi couldn't ignore. "Thank you, Genevieve," Kofi said, his voice flat, his mind still lost in the whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't escape. He wasn't sure what was about her, but perhaps, for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something more real, something more genuine. Kofi Lawson stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city beneath him a blur of constant motion. Outside, life was a race, dreams and desires colliding in the chaos of ambition. Inside, though, there was silence, an unsettling quiet that weighed on him like a heavy cloud. He had it all: the accolades, the wealth, the fame, but none of it seemed to matter. No matter how many companies he built, how many innovations he spearheaded, he was still haunted by a hollow ache, a longing that no amount of money or power could fix. His fingers drummed softly against the polished marble countertop as he glanced down at his phone. A message from Naomi, his girlfriend, blinked up at him. "Missing you, babe. Can't wait to see you. XX." The words were sweet, but they felt rehearsed. He knew Naomi's love, like everything else in his life, came with a price. A price he wasn't always sure he was willing to pay. Behind him, Genevieve entered the room, her presence always quiet, always composed. She stood in the doorway, waiting, her eyes averted, as if she knew better than to intrude on his thoughts. "Sir, the car is ready," she said softly. Kofi nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. There was something about her stillness, something about the way she moved with purpose but never sought attention, that felt different. She wasn't like the others. "Thank you, Genevieve," he replied, his voice betraying none of the thoughts that had begun to swirl in his mind. As he grabbed his coat and prepared to face another day of business and obligations, he couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in the quiet moments between his carefully curated world, Genevieve held the answer he hadn't yet found. Kofi didn't know why he was doing it. Perhaps it was a loneliness that gnawed at him in his quiet moments, the emptiness of his power, or maybe it was a slow unraveling realization that he was tired of being surrounded by people who only saw him for what he could give. Naomi's affection, though constant, was transactional. Chica's loyalty, though fierce, felt like a game of power. And Genevieve was the only one who never asked for anything. The idea nagged at him, deeper than it had before. What if he could strip away the performance? What if he could see, for once, what the people in his life truly valued? It wasn't about catching them in a lie, or playing some sick game of manipulation. It was about clarity. Kofi had spent so many years building walls around himself, walls made of wealth and success. But what he needed now more than ever was truth. That night, after hours of meetings, Kofi sat alone at his desk in the study. The soft glow of a single desk lamp illuminated the space around him, casting gentle shadows on the bookshelves lined with philosophy and psychology texts. The world outside seemed far away, its constant hum of ambition and success suddenly irrelevant. Kofi reached for his phone, his fingers dialing the number he knew by heart. "Max," he said when the call was answered. "It's time. I want full surveillance on them. Discreet, of course. Monitor their purchases, their locations, everything. I need to know what they'll do when they have no limits, no rules." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Understood, sir. We'll begin immediately." Kofi set the phone down, his heart pounding in his chest as he picked up the 3 velvet envelopes that rested on his desk. Each held a black card. Unlimited spending, no limits. He'd given one to Naomi, one to Chica, and one to Genevieve. And for the first time in a long while, he was curious about what they would choose to do with it. Would they indulge themselves in luxury? Or would something deeper reveal itself? The next morning, Kofi met Naomi at the helipad of his private tower. Her arrival was nothing short of grand. The sleek black car rolling to a stop, the sound of her heels clicking against the concrete. She emerged from the car with perfect poise, her platinum blonde hair shining in the sunlight, her lips painted red, her eyes focused on him with that all-too-familiar hunger. "Kofi," she greeted him, her voice sweet, a practiced warmth in her tone as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "You've been distant lately. I missed you." Kofi forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been busy," he replied. She pouted, the kind of pout that had worked on him countless times. "I got something for you," he said, pulling the envelope from his coat pocket. She looked at it with disbelief before ripping it open, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "What is this?" she asked, her fingers trembling as she held the black card. "A gift," Kofi replied coolly. 3 days. Spend it however you like." Her eyes gleamed, and she didn't even wait for him to say more before she spun around and ran to the car, already on her phone dialing her friends. Kofi watched her go, the knot in his chest tightening. He didn't feel elated. He didn't feel proud. He just felt indifferent. Later that day, Kofi sat at his desk, the silence of the study broken only by the soft hum of his computer. His thoughts drifted back to Naomi, to her excitement over the card, and the way her affection was so easily won with a luxury item. It was all too familiar, too shallow. He hadn't expected much from her, but what he'd seen so far made his chest tighten with a mixture of regret and realization. Naomi's actions were predictable, and her heart, it seemed, was only as deep as the price tag on her newest acquisitions. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and Chica entered his office. Her movements were crisp, precise, and she carried herself with an air of confidence that commanded attention. She set a tablet down on his desk, her gaze never leaving him as she slid into the chair opposite him. "I've cleared your schedule for the week. The new reports are ready," she said, her voice professional, even a little cold. Kofi nodded, taking the tablet from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers for just a second, and he noticed how she didn't flinch. She was always composed, always in control, but there was something else, something the way her eyes flickered with ambition whenever she looked at him. Kofi handed her the second envelope, watching her carefully. "Here," he said, "a gift for your hard work. 3 days. Spend it however you want." Chica hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the envelope, then up at Kofi. Her smile was polite, controlled, as she took the card. "Thank you, Kofi," she said. There was no hint of excitement, no exuberance. It was as if she had already known this was coming. Kofi watched her leave, his mind turning over the possibilities of what she might do with the card. She wasn't interested in indulgence. She was interested in power. His suspicions were confirmed less than an hour later when a security team reported that Chica had booked a high-end spa retreat, followed by meetings with rival tech executives, rivals Kofi hadn't even introduced her to. She had used the freedom of the card to solidify her position in his world, not to play, but to climb. The thought lingered with him as he sat back in his chair. He knew Chica had always been calculating, driven by ambition. It wasn't that he disliked her. In fact, there was something magnetic about her focus. But she was playing a game, and in her eyes, he was just another rung on her ladder. Genevieve's choice was different. When Kofi's assistant placed a final envelope on the kitchen counter, Genevieve had simply stood there for a moment, staring at it as though she was unsure whether to open it. Kofi watched from a distance, noting how she never seemed to rush for anything. She was always measured, always calm, but there was a quiet tension in her that Kofi had never been able to place. He had expected her to be hesitant. Unlike Naomi or Chica, Genevieve didn't seem to see the card as a chance to indulge, to buy herself something lavish. Instead, she took it in her hand with the same care she gave her work, as though it were something delicate, something not meant for her. When she knocked softly on his study door a few moments later, Kofi gestured for her to come in. She stepped inside, holding the envelope in both hands, looking up at her with those soft, brown eyes. "Mr. Lawson, I think this was left by mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kofi studied her for a moment. "No mistake. It's for you," he said, keeping his tone even. "Spend it however you like. It's a gift." Genevieve hesitated, clearly not understanding the intent behind it. "But I don't need anything, sir," she replied quietly, her voice filled with reluctance. Kofi could feel the weight of her words, the genuine humility behind them. "Take it, please. You deserve it. 3 days. No strings attached," he said, softening his tone. Genevieve stared at him for a moment longer, as if searching for something in his eyes. Then she nodded, the smallest of smiles tugging at her lips. "Thank you, sir." She turned and left the room as quietly as she had entered, and Kofi felt a strange emptiness settle over him. She hadn't used the card yet, but already she had revealed more than he had expected. By the time the night came, Kofi's security team had sent him the first batch of updates. Naomi had gone all out, splurging on designer handbags, booking a yacht for a private party, and posting everything on social media for the world to see. Chica had used the card for luxury hotels, a spa retreat, and meetings with business executives. But it was Genevieve's choices that caught his attention. She had bought groceries, simple, modest items. Rice, bread, a bouquet of daisies. She had paid her neighbors' medical bills at the local clinic. She had even spent part of the card's funds feeding homeless men on the street. The contrast between them hit Kofi harder than he expected. Naomi's flaunting of her wealth, Chica's strategic use of power. None of it mattered. What mattered was Genevieve's quiet act of kindness, her unspoken generosity. She had done more with less, and it left Kofi feeling something he couldn't quite name. The next day, Kofi sat alone in his study, the silence heavier than usual. His mind kept returning to Genevieve, how she had barely touched the card, how she had refused to indulge in luxury, instead spending her time helping others. It was an unspoken choice, one that spoke volumes more than the flashy purchases Naomi or Chica had made. He felt something shift within him, a deep stirring he couldn't ignore. The room felt colder than usual, the weight of his own wealth pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. For the first time in years, Kofi didn't want to run. He didn't want to escape the world he had built around himself. Instead, he wanted to understand it. Understand her, Genevieve, the quiet strength she embodied, the grace with which she moved through life, untouched by the superficiality that had ensnared the others. That evening, he called them all to dinner. He could feel the tension in the air, a quiet hum of unease that had settled over the mansion. He had promised himself this was about honesty, but as he walked into the dining room, the weight of the words fell heavy on his tongue. Naomi was the first to arrive, her presence as loud as ever, her figure draped in a glittering red dress. She kissed him on the cheek, a practiced affection that didn't quite reach her eyes. Stella was next. The sharp lines of her suit, the meticulously controlled smile. Her posture never wavered, her eyes calculating. She had already begun scanning the room, assessing, analyzing. Chica followed, her movements more reserved, but her gaze just as penetrating. Then, finally, Genevieve entered, her simple cream blouse and floral skirt making her look out of place in the grand dining room. She looked uncomfortable, uncertain, as if she didn't quite belong among them. Kofi could see it, the way she kept her hands tucked in her lap, her eyes avoiding the opulence of the room. As they all took their seats, Kofi couldn't help but notice how different Genevieve seemed compared to the others. Naomi had thrown herself into luxury. Chica had leveraged the situation for power, but Genevieve had chosen something else entirely. And somehow, in the simplicity of her choices, she had revealed everything he needed to know. The dinner was exquisite, the finest wines and meals prepared by the best chefs. But there was a noticeable silence, the kind that filled the room when words were not enough to bridge the growing divide between them all. Finally, Kofi broke the stillness. He spoke slowly, his words careful but deliberate. 3 days ago, he began, I gave each of you a card. No rules, no limits. I want to see who you truly are, what you value when nothing is holding you back. Naomi, you spent more than most people would in a lifetime on clothes, jewelry, and a yacht. Stella, you booked yourself into the most exclusive resorts and business meetings. But Genevieve... He paused, watching her carefully as she shifted in her seat, not meeting his gaze. Genevieve, he continued, his voice softening, you spent less than $100, and yet you gave more than I've ever received from anyone. You didn't seek attention. You didn't buy anything for yourself. You helped others. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Naomi's eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Kofi held up a hand, silencing her. This isn't about money, Kofi said, his voice low but firm. It never was. It's about character. And in the quiet moments, when no one was watching, Genevieve revealed something that none of us could see. She gave, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because it's who she is. Genevieve looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected this. Kofi saw her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but there was something else there, something he hadn't expected. Gratitude. The silence in the room grew heavier. Naomi shifted uncomfortably, her hand tightening around her wine glass. Stella's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes hard. The tension was palpable. But Kofi couldn't ignore what he had seen, what he had learned in the last few days. Genevieve, in her quiet humility, had shown him something real, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to protect himself anymore. As Kofi sat back in his chair, he watched the reactions of the women around him, their faces shifting from confusion to discomfort. Naomi's mouth tightened, the kind of tension that came when she didn't get the attention she craved. Chica remained stoic, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though calculating the next move in a game. Genevieve, on the other hand, avoided looking at him directly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. The contrast between them all seemed so stark in that moment. Naomi, with her bold, flashy persona, Chica, with her cool, calculating ambition, and Genevieve, who simply existed with a quiet grace, unaffected by the luxuries around her. Kofi felt a strange sense of longing stir within him, the desire to reach for something real, something that wasn't built on appearances or power dynamics. Naomi finally spoke, her voice sharp with the need to regain control of the conversation. Kofi, I don't understand. We've been together for so long. You know what I want. You know what I've sacrificed to be here. What more could you possibly want from me? Her words dripped with frustration, the raw edge of entitlement shining through. Kofi didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang in the air, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't owe her an explanation, but somehow, in the stillness of that moment, he felt as though he owed himself one. "It's not about what you've sacrificed," Kofi said quietly, his voice low but steady. "It's about what's real, what you do when no one's watching, when you have everything you need but still choose to give. Genevieve, she didn't ask for anything. She just gave. And that's the difference." Naomi's eyes flared with anger, and Kofi could feel the tension between them shift. She leaned forward, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "So that's it? You're going to choose her over me? Over everything we built?" "No," Kofi replied firmly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm choosing truth over illusion. I'm choosing kindness over manipulation. And I'm choosing the person who showed me that, even in a world of excess, there's something worth more than money. Something real." Genevieve glanced up at him, her eyes soft but guarded. The quiet humility she had shown in the past few days spoke volumes, but also left her vulnerable. She hadn't expected Kofi to see her this way, hadn't expected him to acknowledge the simple, quiet things she had done. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. There was a part of her that had always kept a safe distance, always told herself that she could never afford to be entangled in someone like Kofi's world. But now, with his word hanging in the air, something inside her stirred, a longing she couldn't ignore. The rest of dinner passed in strained silence, the conversation dying quickly under the weight of unspoken thoughts. When the plates were cleared and the candles flickered low, Kofi stood from the table, his movements slow, deliberate. He turned toward Genevieve, his gaze locking with hers. "Genevieve," he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "Thank you for showing me what I was blind to." Her heart raced in her chest, her breath catching at the sincerity in his tone. She had expected nothing from him, not even a thank you, but his words hit deeper than she anticipated, a warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the money or the lavish setting. It was real, and for the first time, she allowed herself to soften, to let down the walls she'd built around her heart. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, charged with quiet intensity that neither of them knew how to navigate. Kofi's gaze lingered on Genevieve for a moment longer, his eyes searching hers. It was as if in that moment, the world outside his penthouse, his empire, his reputation, his wealth, had faded away. All that remained was his connection, this silent exchange that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Genevieve shifted slightly in her seat, her body tense, but not out of fear, out of something more vulnerable. She had never expected Kofi to see her, not like this. She had kept her distance, deliberately shutting herself off from the world he lived in. Yet now, she felt something stirring inside her that she couldn't ignore. "I wasn't trying to impress you, Kofi," she said quietly, her voice soft yet steady. Her eyes met his, and there was no pretending, no masks, just the raw honesty that had always defined her. "I've never wanted anything from you. But you?" She paused, her heart beating faster as she spoke, her emotions slipping past control she had worked so hard to maintain. "You've never really seen me. Not for who I am. Not until now." Kofi's chest tightened at her words. His instincts told him to respond, to say something comforting, but all he could do was watch her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, as though there were nothing else but the two of them in that moment. For the first time in his life, Kofi didn't feel the need to protect himself. In fact, for the first time, he felt like he was on the edge of something important, something real. His mind flashed back to the past few days, to the test he had set up, the observations. Naomi, Chica, they had played the game. They had followed the script of what he expected, indulging in materialism and ambition. But Genevieve, Genevieve had shocked him. "I'm sorry," Kofi said quietly, his voice thick with sincerity. "I should have seen you for who you really are. I've been surrounded by people who only see me for what I can give them. But you were different. I've been looking for something real, Genevieve, and I didn't realize I had it all along." Genevieve's heart pounded in her chest as the weight of his words settled in. She had never expected this. The simple truth was that she had always kept her distance, unwilling to admit the feelings she had for him, feelings that went deeper than she cared to explore. And now, as the walls between them seemed to melt away, she could feel something stirring within her, something that had been dormant for far too long. She stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, as though she was giving herself permission to step closer to him. The room seemed to shrink with each passing second, the air thick with anticipation. And then, without thinking, without second-guessing herself, she closed the distance between them. Kofi's breath hitched as Genevieve's hand gently rested on his chest. He looked down at her, surprised by the sudden closeness, by the warmth of her touch. And then she lifted her gaze to meet his, her brown eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Vulnerability, yes, but also a depth of longing that matched his own. "I didn't want to need you, Kofi," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I do." Without a word, Kofi closed the remaining distance between them, pulling her into his arms. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as if both of them were testing the waters of this new, uncharted territory. But then it deepened, the tension between them growing with every passing second. Kofi's lips moved against hers with urgency, his hands tracing the curve of her back, pulling her closer. Genevieve's hand slid up his chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened further, a wave of heat rushing between them. She had never felt this before, the raw, unfiltered desire that surged through her, making everything else feel insignificant. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the way Kofi's body pressed against hers, the way his touch made her feel alive in a way she never thought possible. Kofi's heart raced as he kissed her, his hands finding the delicate line of her jaw, tilting her face upward to deepen the kiss even further. His world, once so centered on wealth and status, now felt distant. All that was left was this, the woman in his arms, her soft body pressed against his, their hearts beating in synchrony. When they finally pulled apart, gasping for air, neither of them spoke for a long while. There was no need for words. They both understood. The emotions that had been building between them, silent, intense, undeniable, had finally been released. Genevieve's eyes met Kofi's, her chest still heaving with the weight of their kiss. "I never wanted anything from you, Kofi," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I think I might want more now, more than I've ever allowed myself to want." Kofi's hands cupped her face, his gaze softening as he gazed into her eyes. "Then take it, Genevieve. Take everything I've kept locked away." The world outside continued to pulse with life, but within the walls of Kofi's penthouse, time seemed to stand still. He could feel Genevieve's heart beating beneath his fingertips, the rhythmic thump of vulnerability and desire that matched his own. Her words echoed in his mind. "I never wanted anything from you, but I think I might want more now." And in that moment, Kofi knew that whatever they had built together, whatever they were starting to build, was real. It was not built on power, on status, or even on money. It was built on something far more precious. As he looked at her, standing in front of her with eyes full of longing, he realized just how much he had been craving the simplicity of honesty, of connection. He had surrounded himself with the glittering illusions of wealth, thinking it would bring him happiness. But here, in the quiet space between them, he found something far more valuable. Genevieve's hands trembled as she touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp angles of his jaw, the stubble growing along his skin. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, afraid to trust, afraid to feel. But with him, there was no need for fear. There was only a growing warmth, a pull she couldn't deny. She kissed him again, her lips softer this time, filled with an unspoken promise. Kofi's hands moved to her back, pulling her closer, his fingers tracing the curve of her body. The tension between them was palpable, thick with the anticipation of something neither of them had ever fully allowed themselves to experience. As they pulled away again, their breaths heavy and mixed with the taste of each other, Kofi spoke, his voice low and filled with certainty. "Genevieve, you've shown me a world I never even knew I wanted," he whispered, his thumb brushing over her lips. "And I want to show you the world I've kept hidden, the part of me I've locked away." She smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. "Then show me," she whispered back, her voice thick with desire. The evening stretched on as the world outside faded into the background, leaving only the two of them in this moment of shared discovery. Kofi, the billionaire who had always kept control, who had built his life on ambition and calculated decisions, now found himself unraveling in a way he had never allowed before. With Genevieve, he was learning to be vulnerable, to open up, to experience a love he never thought possible. As the night wore on, their intimacy grew deeper, more profound. Every touch, every kiss was a revelation, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing in both of their lives. The walls Kofi had spent so long building around himself began to crumble, brick by brick, as Genevieve showed him what it meant to truly feel, to truly connect. Genevieve, too, found herself surrendering to the moment, her heart opening in a way it never had before. She had spent so long being strong, being independent, never allowed herself to lean on anyone. But Kofi's touch, his words, his presence, it was as if it unlocked a part of her that had been buried beneath years of self-protection. In each other, they discovered a new kind of love, a love built not on expectation, but on mutual understanding, on deep connection, on a desire to be vulnerable together. Kofi's wealth, his power, his status, all that felt irrelevant in the face of what they were creating. The real treasure, he realized, wasn't the money. It was the trust, the intimacy, the raw, unfiltered connection that he had always craved but never allowed himself to embrace. As the night ended and the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Kofi lay beside Genevieve, his arm wrapped around her as they both drifted into a peaceful sleep. There was no need for more words. They had already said everything that needed to be said, and the quiet touch of their skin, the warmth of their bodies, the shared moments of tenderness and passion. For the first time in his life, Kofi Lawson felt complete, not because of his empire, not because of the millions he had amassed, but because he had found something real, something he never thought he needed, something he had overlooked in his quest for everything else. He had found Genevieve, and she had found him. The next morning, Kofi woke before the sun had fully risen, the weight of everything that had happened over the past few days settling around him. His thoughts drifted to Genevieve, who was still asleep beside him, her head resting on his chest. He smiled softly, watching her peaceful face, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He ran his fingers through her hair, the act of tenderness almost foreign to him, yet felt natural, as though it was always meant to be. Genevieve stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open as she glanced up at him, a soft smile forming on her lips. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep, but filled with warmth. "Good morning," Kofi replied, his voice low but steady. He leaned down to kiss her forehead, the simplicity of the act almost taking his breath away. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for diamonds or yachts. What mattered now was this shared moment, this quiet connection. Genevieve stretched, her body pressed against his, and she nestled closer to him, her breath warm against his chest. "I didn't expect any of this," she said softly, her fingers tracing circles on his skin. "But I'm glad I did." Kofi smiled, his heart full as he held her close. "Me too," he murmured. "Me too." As they lay there together, Kofi knew that the world had shifted, that he had found something far more valuable than any wealth he could ever acquire, and for the first time he felt truly at peace.